In today's episode of the Daily Brief, I'll talk about two interesting stories. I first talk about SEBI unearthing a rupees 173 crore insider trading scam, and finally, I talk about ASEAN's ambitious power grid. Welcome back to the Daily Brief show by Zerodha, where our aim is to simplify the biggest news in the financial markets in a way that's one level deeper as compared to news channels. I'm your host Akshara, and today is Friday, 17th October. Coming to the first story. So yesterday, SEBI passed an interim order against 8 people for what it calls one of the most serious insider trading cases in recent memory. This one involved the Indian Energy Exchange, or IEX. The story involves a government official who allegedly leaked confidential regulatory information to a former student who then passed it to friends and family. Together, they made a whopping rupees 173 crore by betting on IEX's stock price crashing before the rest of the market knew what was coming. Let's dive into how this scam unraveled itself. So the story starts with a decision made by the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, or CERC. On July 23rd, CERC officially introduced something called market coupling, a change that would fundamentally alter how electricity is traded in India. So how does market coupling even work? See, the IEX runs India's biggest platform for short-term power trading, where electricity producers and buyers match bids for the next day. Under the old system, each exchange, that's IEX, PXIL and HPX, discovered its own prices. Under market coupling, a single central system would now set a uniform price across all exchanges. We had covered this change earlier, especially how it could end IEX's dominant role in price discovery and maybe even trim its margins. And investors knew this possibility. The next morning, IEX's stock collapsed almost 30%, one of its steepest one-day falls ever. However, when regulators looked back at the trading data from that fateful day, something didn't add up. A few days before CERC's order on July 21st and 22nd, there was a sudden burst of trading in IEX put options. So a put option is a bet that a stock will fall. And as we know, with the CERC's new order, the IEX's dominance was about to decline. Those puts led to enormous profits when the order came into effect. Now the pattern was way too clean to ignore. Almost no trading in those contracts before, a huge spike ahead of the announcement, and then total silence after. So SEBI had to step in. Its surveillance systems had already picked up the strange movement, and around the same time, it also received a complaint pointing to possible insider trading. So SEBI immediately launched an investigation and began connecting all the dots to reveal the underbelly of this trade. So firstly, SEBI noticed that the same small set of names kept showing up across multiple trades. They weren't regular derivatives traders. In fact, most of them had never traded a single IEX option of any kind before. Yet, in those 2 days before the order, they all suddenly piled into put options on IEX. Their timing was impeccable. When the order came out on July 23rd, the stock fell sharply the next day. And by July 28th, they had closed out their positions, locking in massive profits. Bhuvan Singh, one of the traders, alone made about rupees 72 crore. Others made anywhere between rupees 2 and rupees 35 crore each. And in total, the group netted rupees 173 crore in profits in just a few days. But who were these people and how did they even know this was coming? The key link, SEBI says, runs through Bhuvan Singh. He wasn't an employee at IEX or a market insider in the traditional sense. However, his connection to the CERC was far more unusual. He knew a senior official at CERC referred to in the order as O1. O1 wasn't just your average bureaucrat. She was a chief in CERC's economics division who was directly involved in drafting the market coupling order. And interestingly, SEBI found out that Bhuvan Singh had once been her student. And that's how this trail starts. A professor and a former student connected over WhatsApp, exchanging messages that contain sensitive regulatory information. Inside CERC, discussions about market coupling had been going on for over a year. The Commission had formed a committee to explore how to implement it, and in their fourth meeting in Jan 2025, they finally produced a set of recommendations on how coupling could begin. The leak started with internal documents from CERC's economics division being shared with Bhuvan Singh on WhatsApp and email. On February 20th, for instance, minutes of the January meeting were circulated inside CERC. And on the same day, SEBI says they were also forwarded to Bhuvan Singh, who then shared them in a WhatsApp group called OTC. Now, the group wasn't made of CERC officials, but of the people involved in the trade. And this group became SEBI's biggest clue. Investigators found that Bhuvan had been sending messages there regularly, often relaying updates he received from O1 and another CERC official referred to as O2. Then a fifth meeting on June 30th, 2025 finalized the implementation plan. Those minutes were internal and they weren't meant to be public until the formal order came out. However, by mid-July, history repeated itself. The minutes of the June meeting also surfaced in the same WhatsApp group, but the rabbit hole doesn't end there either. On July 14th, Bhuvan Singh told Sanjeev Kumar, a member of OTC, that the order could be out soon. And the very next day, Sanjeev showed up at CERC's office. He was the managing director of a company called GNA Energy, which itself was a CERC regulated entity. SEBI found that he met officials inside the office and even shared a photo in the group that showed a live stream of a CERC meeting. So by now, the group knew the timing. And between July 21st and 22nd, the trades began. To buy the IEX put options, this group used different trading accounts spread across family members to spread out their exposure. Bhuvan had access to some of these accounts, and in one case, Sanjeev placed trades using his wife Bindu Sharma's account. These weren't small-time retail bets either. They were huge positions worth crores. Bhuvan Singh was not at all a regular trader. SEBI examined his phone to find search histories that showed he had been looking up tutorials on how put options work, along with searches on how the CERC order could affect IEX's stock. Clearly, the leader of this wolf pack didn't know much about how the market worked and had probably never placed a put option before in his life. But he had learned just in time to place the perfect bet. When CERC's market coupling order went public on July 23rd after market hours, the IEX stock plunged 29.6% the next day. The put options that cost just a few rupees suddenly exploded in value. By July 28th, the traders had squared off, booking their profits. Once SEBI's surveillance team spotted the pattern, it didn't take long to move in. Between September 18th to 20th, it conducted search and seizure operations at the homes and offices of the suspects. And officers recovered laptops, phones, and confidential CERC documents that told the rest of the story. Now, besides this, in Bhuvan Singh's phone, SEBI's forensic team had also found traces of deleted WhatsApp and Signal chats with O1. After the trades on July 31st, the NSE sent queries to some of these traders asking for explanations about their sudden activity in IEX options. Right after that, SEBI says the WhatsApp chats between Bhuvan and O1 disappeared. But the backups and signal messages remained. One of the surviving messages sent on September 20th, 2 months after the trading, showed O1 forwarding a copy of IEX's legal appeal to Bhuvan. Clearly, the guilty parties were still communicating after the trade, perhaps about how they could evade the law. This is another sign that they knew what they had done and were trying to erase the trail. SEBI also found bank transfers showing that part of the profits from these trades were moved into 3 connected companies which had overlapping ownership with the families involved. So on October 15th, SEBI issued its interim order. It froze a total of Rs 173.14 crore, matching the alleged illegal profits, and restrained all 8 people from trading in the market until further notice. The order directs them to park the frozen amount in fixed deposits under a lien to SEBI and to submit a full inventory of all their bank and demat accounts within 15 days. SEBI also clarified that these findings are prima facie, meaning preliminary, and the accused can file their replies within 21 days and request a personal hearing. For now, the goal is to prevent the money from being moved or spent before the final decision is made. Now, the investigation isn't over. The 8 individuals have 21 days to respond to SEBI's findings and can request a personal hearing. The regulator will continue examining digital evidence, financial trails, and any links to others who might have had access to CERC's internal files. Once that's done, SEBI will issue a final order. If the violations are confirmed, it can impose penalties, order disgorgement of profits, or even permanently bar them from trading. Now coming to the second story. We often talk about international trade in goods and services. Whether it's a net good or bad for the economy is up for debate. And Trump, for one, clearly thinks it's bad for the US, hence all the tariffs. But there's something else that's traded across borders which doesn't feel very intuitive: electricity. Unlike electronics or crude oil, which can be shipped anywhere in the world through sea routes, electricity is bound by geography. You can only trade power through transmission lines, and no transmission means no trade, which means an interconnected grid is everything. India, unfortunately, doesn't have the most cooperative neighbors for this. We don't have many logical trading partners when it comes to electricity, and even with the few we've tried, it hasn't exactly been smooth sailing. Elsewhere, though, this is a big deal. Europe is a giant interconnected grid, and that's no small achievement. Building transmission infrastructure itself is a massive technical challenge, but getting so many countries to coordinate and run it smoothly is nothing short of remarkable. Today, we're talking about another lesser known multinational grid that's closer to home: the ASEAN Power Grid. Conceptualized in 1997, it spent a long time stuck in limbo but is now finally gathering pace. This story is about what happened there, what went right, what went wrong, why getting such projects off the ground takes so much effort, and whether interconnected grids are actually worth all the effort. By the end, we'll hopefully have learned a thing or two about power systems, a bit of geopolitics, and a lot about transmission. Let's dive in. Imagine a giant electricity network stretching across Southeast Asia, seamlessly connecting all 10 ASEAN countries. That's the vision behind the ASEAN Power Grid, or APG. The idea dates back to the late 1990s, but progress was sluggish for decades. Now, however, this long held dream is gathering momentum after years of inertia. So, why the renewed interest? One obvious big reason is climate change. Southeast Asian or SEA nations are looking for ways to cut carbon emissions and meet their climate pledges, and they're realizing they can't get there alone. So, in other words, countries like Singapore, Vietnam, or Indonesia will find it much easier to shift to clean energy if they can trade electricity with neighbors. A shared regional grid would let a country with surplus renewable power, say hydroelectric dams in Laos or wind farms in Vietnam, export it to places facing power deficits and vice versa. In fact, as per some expert estimates, better regional power integration could slash the cost of decarbonization by about $800 billion or 11% compared to each country going it alone. Beyond climate concerns, practical economics are also at play. For one, SEA's power demand is soaring. The region is on track to see one of the fastest electricity consumption growth rates in the world over the next decade. At the same time, their governments are under pressure to keep energy affordable and reliable. Additionally, a regional grid can resolve demand-supply mismatches. Laos, for instance, has abundant supply of hydropower that it can't fully consume itself. On the other hand, Singapore is trying to decarbonize itself but doesn't have enough land to install large solar farms or hydroelectric dams and has always been reliant on imports for its own power needs. An ASEAN grid would solve both of their problems. A unified grid potentially promises cheaper, more secure power for nearly 68 crore people. Instead of each nation building expensive backup power plants or suffering blackouts, they could buy electricity from a neighbor through the grid when needed. And this kind of cross border trading could lower overall generation costs and reduce reliance on polluting fossil fuels. A more integrated ASEAN grid might even trim consumer electricity prices by up to 3.9% across the region, a win-win for wallets and the environment. So, what does a regional power grid look like in practice? Rather than one physical mega grid being built overnight, the ASEAN Power Grid is coming together through dozens of cross-border links and trading arrangements piece by piece. Think of it as connecting the dots, first between two neighboring countries, and then gradually expanding those links into a wider network that spans the whole region. The ultimate goal is a fully integrated Europe-style power system by 2045, where electricity flows freely across borders as needed. But getting there is a phased journey. The first phase is bilateral connections, building grid interconnectors between two countries. Now, many such links already exist. Malaysia and Thailand's grids are linked at their border, as are Thailand and Laos, Laos and Vietnam, and so on. These lines allow one country to directly buy power from another. For example, Thailand generally imports electricity from hydroelectric dams in Laos via dedicated transmission lines. These one-to-one deals prove that cross-border trade is feasible technically and commercially. The second phase is multilateral trading projects. The next step is linking multiple countries in a single power exchange agreement, essentially expanding them from bilateral to small multilateral pilots. The most notable breakthrough here is the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore Power Integration Project, or LTMS PIP. So it works like this: Laos generates hydropower and sends it into Thailand's grid. And from Thailand, the power flows into Malaysia and ultimately into Singapore. This makes LTMS PIP a proof of concept that multiple ASEAN countries can coordinate to buy and sell electricity as a group. However, it's worth noting that currently it's still a relatively small, one directional deal, largely relying on existing bilateral connections. Another ambitious multilateral initiative on the drawing board is the Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines Power Integration Project, or BIMP PIP. This one aims to connect the power grids across countries with lots of islands and sea between them. And unlike the land-based links of mainland SEA, the BIMP PIP will require undersea cables to hop between islands. The vision is for two-way flows of clean energy, but it's a far more complex undertaking than LTMS PIP, both technically and financially. The third phase will aim at creating one unified grid. In the long run, by the 2040s, ASEAN's goal is to weave these bilateral and multilateral links into a fully integrated regional grid with an open electricity market. In practical terms, this could mean a future where, say, a surplus of midday solar power in Indonesia could instantly be sent to help power factories in Thailand. Or a wind farm in Vietnam could ramp up output to keep Singapore's data centers running after dark. That is the endgame. So, what's the holdup? If the ASEAN Power Grid sounds so great on paper and is the need of the hour, you might wonder why it isn't already a done deal. The truth is, building an integrated regional grid is hard for a mix of technical, financial, market, and political reasons. So here's a breakdown of the key challenges holding the project back. First, we have the technical challenges. It's very tough to synchronize electricity systems across 10 different countries. Power grids need common standards and grid codes to operate in unison, which ASEAN currently lacks. So let's understand this with an example. India and EU operate their grids at 50 Hz frequency. However, India's grid often fluctuates around 49.5 to 50.5 Hz. The EU grid is kept extremely tight, usually between 49.95 and 50.05 Hz. These tiny differences matter. Cross-border links need both sides to stay stable, otherwise power can trip or destabilize the network. There's also the basic issue of reliability. If one country's grid experiences a blackout, how do you prevent that from cascading to neighbors through the interconnections? This is something that actually happened to Spain this year because of a fault in an interconnection line with France. These technical hurdles mean progress has been cautious and countries are careful about hooking up to a neighbor's grid if it could introduce instability to their own network. And then we have the financial costs. Building an ASEAN-wide power grid is an expensive proposition. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars in new infrastructure like high voltage transmission lines, subsea cables, substations, and so on. The Asian Development Bank, or ADB, estimates that the region will need to invest at least $100 billion by 2045 just on cross-border transmission lines. ASEAN officials have put the total price tag for the full grid vision as high as $764 billion. The ADB and World Bank recently launched an ASEAN Power Grid financing initiative, with the ADB committing $10 billion to kickstart projects. But that's just a fraction of what's needed. Private investors are afraid of putting money into giant transmission projects unless they're confident they'll get paid back, which requires stable agreements between countries. The cost challenge is especially high for the island connections. Linking, say, the Philippines or Indonesia's archipelago to the mainland grid means laying very long, very high capacity cables under the sea. That's vastly more expensive than building overland lines. And then we have market mismatches. Even if the physical wires are in place, you need compatible market rules to trade electricity smoothly. Here, ASEAN's diversity becomes an obstacle. Some member states like Singapore have liberalized electricity markets. Multiple power generators compete and trade on a wholesale market, and prices fluctuate with supply and demand. Others like Laos, Malaysia, and Thailand still use a single buyer model where a state owned utility company controls all power purchases and sales, somewhat like India. These different market structures make regional trading very tricky. For instance, Singapore might want to buy power in real time from whoever offers the best price. But if Laos, on the other hand, has only one state utility that sells at a fixed price under long term contracts, how do you reconcile that? Each country has its own laws on energy imports and exports, tariffs, and monopolies. Harmonizing these rules or creating a regional marketplace for electricity is a slow process. And then we have political will. To be fair, the technology exists, the capital can be raised, and markets can be designed. All of it becomes possible if there's enough political will. Energy policy touches on national sovereignty. Governments can be uncomfortable about depending on neighbors for something as critical as electricity. In ASEAN, decision making is consensus driven and member states guard their autonomy very closely. Getting all countries to agree on bold, long term infrastructure sharing is not easy. Some countries forged ahead on bilateral deals that suited them, but there wasn't always a collective drive to push the regional project as a top priority. So, in short, technical, financial, market, and political issues have all conspired to keep the ASEAN power grid progressing slower than hoped. As of now, only about half of the 18 originally planned interconnection projects have been completed, and most of those are just basic two country links. The full integrated grid is still a very long way off. So, a fully connected ASEAN power grid could be transformative, cutting fossil fuel reliance, lowering energy costs, and boosting the region's competitiveness. It would let renewable power flow across borders to where it's needed, creating a more secure and efficient energy system. Beyond ASEAN, it could eventually anchor an Asian supergrid linking India, China, and beyond, a distant but powerful vision. If countries align, this grid won't only be a success story for renewable energy, it could actually light the way for a new model of cooperation between countries in today's tense times. Now, coming to the tidbits. India's palm oil imports fell 16% in September to a 4-month low as refiners switched to cheaper soy oil, whose imports hit their highest since 2022. In an earlier episode, we covered the trade chaos of our cooking oil. Now, coming to the next tidbit. Just a few days back, we spoke about coking coal. Now, India's steel mills are facing a met coke crunch, meeting barely half their needs in the first half of 2025. Producers like JSW and ArcelorMittal are urging the government to ease import curbs that have tightened supplies. Now, coming to the next tidbit. Hyundai Motor will invest Rs 45,000 crore in India over 5 years with 26 product launches, including 7 new models and its first locally made electric SUV by 2027. The company aims to make India a global export hub, crossing Rs 1 trillion in revenue by FY30. That's all the news I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one.
Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.